dear students, nice to see you again. In the fourth unit, you will study the legal terminology from the case studied by the European Court of Justice. In its over 25,000 rulings, the Court of Justice of the European Union has rendered decisions directly affecting the lives of many European Union citizens. So, my dear friends, we are going to read the request for the preliminary ruling concerning the interpretation of the European Union law on the award of a public contract without a public tendering procedure, a so-called in-house award. This request was submitted in a dispute between Undis Servizi and the municipality of Sulmona, Italy, for the award of a public contract for services by that municipality to Cogesa SPA. So, let's get started. Check your pronunciation of the words and word combinations. Chamber, preliminary ruling, be composed of, registrar, interpretation, award of a public contract.
Once more, chamber, preliminary ruling, be composed of, registrar, interpretation, award of a public contract.
Repeat after the teacher. Chamber, preliminary ruling, be composed of, registrar, interpretation, award of a public contract.
Once again, chamber, preliminary ruling, be composed of, registrar, interpretation, award of a public contract.
Repeat and remember the translation. Chamber,
Колегія суддів,
preliminary ruling,
попередня ухвала, попереднє рішення.
be composed of,
У складі
registrar,
секретар суду,
interpretation,
тлумачення,
award of a public contract.
надавати державні контракти. Once more, chamber,
Колегія суддів,
preliminary ruling,
попередня ухвала, попереднє рішення.
be composed of,
У складі
registrar,
секретар суду,
interpretation,
тлумачення,
award of a public contract.
надавати державні контракти. Give your translation of the words. Chamber,
Колегія суддів,
preliminary ruling,
попередня ухвала, попереднє рішення.
be composed of,
У складі
registrar,
секретар суду,
interpretation,
тлумачення,
award of a public contract.
надавати державні контракти. Once more, chamber,
Колегія суддів,
preliminary ruling,
попередня ухвала, попереднє рішення.
be composed of,
У складі
registrar,
секретар суду,
interpretation,
тлумачення,
award of a public contract.
надавати державні контракти. Give your English translation of the words. Колегія суддів,
Chamber.
Попередня ухвала, попереднє рішення.
Preliminary ruling.
У складі.
Be composed of.
Секретар суду.
Registrar.
Тлумачення.
Interpretation.
Надавати державні контракти.
Award of a public contract. Once more. Колегія суддів.
Chamber.
Попередня ухвала, попереднє рішення.
Preliminary ruling.
У складі.
Be composed of.
Секретар суду.
Registrar.
Тлумачення.
Interpretation.
Надавати державні контракти.
Award of a public contract. And now you have 30 seconds to recall and write down the words you have just studied.
Chamber. Preliminary ruling. Be composed of. Registrar. Interpretation. Award of a public contract.
So, I'm sure you did your best, didn't you? Define the words as legal terms and write definitions in your notebook. Here is a model for you. Chamber is a legislative or judicial body. Preliminary ruling. Registrar. Interpretation. A public contract. And now, my dear friends, read the case of Undis Servizi against the State Council of Italy to find the words in the sentences.
Chamber. Preliminary ruling. Be composed of. Interpretation. Award of a public contract.
Fill in the gaps in the sentences using the words from the list. Preliminary ruling. Composed. Interpretation. Award of a public contract. Registrar. Chamber.
Categorize the highlighted words by the parts of the speech. Produce as many parts of the speech as possible from the given words. The court was composed of a president of the chamber, advocate general, and registrar. Here is a model for you. The highlighted word is registrar, which is a noun. It can also have a form of a noun as registration. As a verb, it is register.
Define the parts of the speech of the highlighted words and produce as many derivatives as possible. It follows that the questions referred for a preliminary ruling must be assessed ratione temporis in the light of Directive 2004/18 alone as interpreted by the court's case law. The highlighted word here is ruling. The request for a preliminary ruling concerns the interpretation of EU law on the award of a public contract without a public tendering procedure, a so-called in-house award. The highlighted word is interpretation. EU rules on the award of public contracts in force at the time of the facts in the main proceedings did not provide for the possibility of a direct award of a public contract without the initiation of a tendering procedure. The highlighted word here is award of a contract. Develop your own sentences with the words from the list and put them down in your notebooks. Chamber. Preliminary ruling. Be composed of. Registrar. Interpretation. Award of a public contract. Here's one more tip for you to be more effective in your learning. Researchers say that one of the most effective techniques for successful learning was developed by an Italian, Francesco Cirillo. The technique is called the Pomodoro technique. His technique uses a timer to break down work into intervals, traditionally 25 minutes in length, separated by short breaks. He called these intervals Pomodoros, after the tomato-shaped kitchen timer he used as a university student. Cirillo broke down the technique into 6 steps. 1. Decide on the task to be done. 2. Set the Pomodoro timing, traditionally 25 minutes. 3. Work the task until the timer rings. 4. After the timer rings, put a check mark on a piece of paper. 5. If you have fewer than 4 check marks, take a short break, 3-5 minutes, then go to step 2. And the last, after 4 Pomodoros, take a longer break, 15-30 minutes, reset your check mark, count to 0, then go to step 1. Check your pronunciation of the words and word combinations. Public tendering procedure. Dispute. Public supply contract. Regulatory framework. Pecuniary interest. Conclude.
Once more. Public tendering procedure. Dispute. Public supply contract. Regulatory framework. Pecuniary interest. Conclude.
Repeat after the teacher. Public tendering procedure. Dispute. Public supply contract. Regulatory framework. Pecuniary interest. Conclude.
Once again. Public tendering procedure. Dispute. Public supply contract. Regulatory framework. Pecuniary interest. Conclude.
Repeat and remember the translation. Public tendering procedure.
Відкрита тендерна процедура.
Dispute.
Спор-суперечка.
Public supply contract.
Відкритий контракт на постачання.
Regulatory framework.
Нормативна база.
Pecuniary interest.
Матеріальна вигода.
Conclude.
Укладати. Once more. Public tendering procedure.
Відкрита тендерна процедура.
Dispute.
Спор-суперечка.
Public supply contract.
Відкритий контракт на постачання.
Regulatory framework.
Нормативна база.
Pecuniary interest.
Матеріальна вигода.
Conclude.
Укладати. Give your translation of the words. Public tendering procedure.
Відкрита тендерна процедура.
Dispute.
Спор-суперечка.
Public supply contract.
Відкрити контракт на постачання.
Regulatory framework.
Нормативна база.
Pecuniary interest.
Матеріальна вигода.
Conclude.
Укладати. Once again. Public tendering procedure.
Відкрита тендерна процедура.
Dispute.
Спор, суперечка.
Public supply contract.
Відкритий контракт на постачання.
Regulatory framework.
Нормативна база.
Pecuniary interest.
Матеріальна вигода.
Conclude.
Укладати. Give your English translation of the words. Відкрита тендерна процедура.
Public tendering procedure.
Спор, суперечка.
Dispute.
Відкритий контракт на постачання.
Public supply contract.
Нормативна база.
Regulatory framework.
Матеріальна вигода.
Pecuniary interest.
Укладати.
Conclude. Once more. Відкрита тендерна процедура.
Public tendering procedure.
Спор, суперечка.
Dispute.
Відкрити контракт на постачання.
Public supply contract.
Нормативна база.
Regulatory framework.
Матеріальна вигода.
Pecuniary interest.
Укладати.
Conclude. Now you have 30 seconds to recall and write down the words you have just learned in your notebooks.
Public tendering procedure. Dispute. Public supply contract. Regulatory framework. Pecuniary interest. Conclude.
I believe you did your best, didn't you? Define the words as legal terms and write the definitions in your notebooks. Here is a model for you. Tendering refers to the process whereby governments and financial institutions invite bids for large projects that must be submitted within a finite deadline. Dispute, public supply contract, regulatory framework, pecuniary interest. Conclude. And now read the case of Undi Servizi against the Council of State of Italy to find the examples of the words in sentences. Write them down in your notebooks.
Public tendering procedure. Dispute. Public supply contract. Regulatory framework. Pecuniary interest. Conclude.
Fill in the gaps in the sentences using the words from the list. Pecuniary interest, public supply contract, dispute, public tendering procedure, regulatory framework.
Categorize the highlighted words by the parts of the speech. Produce as many parts of the speech as possible from the given words. On the 30th October 2014, although the contract for services had not yet been concluded, the local authorities entered into an agreement to exercise a control. Here is a model for you. Conclude is a highlighted word, which is a verb. Conclusion is a noun.
Define the parts of speech of the highlighted words in the sentences and produce as many derivatives as possible. Consequently, in the light of that case law, in the dispute in the main proceedings, the local authorities which are not shareholders of Kagesa must be regulated as third parties. The highlighted word here is dispute. The direct award of a contract may be made to wholly public companies which comply with the European Union regulatory requirements for in-house management and which are in any event owned by local authority within the territory concerned. The highlighted words here are public and regulatory. Alleging infringements of code on public works contracts, public service contracts and public supply contracts in implementation of Directive 2004/17/EC, Undis claimed that the two conditions required for that contract of services to be awarded on an in-house basis had not been met. The highlighted word here is supply. Develop your own sentences with the words from the list and write them down in your notebooks. Public tendering procedure, dispute, public supply contract, regulatory framework, pecuniary interest, conclude. The European Union Court of Justice has produced decisions affecting a wide range of matters concerning the lives of the European Union citizens. And now, my dear friends, will you watch the video on how the court's decisions safeguard the European Union citizens' rights concerning the air travel, transborder healthcare, and their rights in the digital world. So follow the course and feel confident in legal English.
As citizens of the European Union, we all have rights under EU law. These rights are ultimately interpreted and safeguarded by the Court of Justice of the European Union. In over 25,000 rulings to date, the Court has given decisions on a wide variety of matters, directly affecting our lives. Example Case 1. Air passenger rights. Thanks to court judgments, if your flight is delayed by more than 3 hours, you can claim compensation. The court has also ensured that airlines cannot cite technical problems as an excuse to avoid paying. Example Case 2. Google and the right to be forgotten. The Court of Justice has ruled that EU citizens have a right to ask a search engine, such as Google, to remove entries relating to them from the list of search results following a search on their name, giving us greater control over our presence on the web. Example Case 3. Medical treatment within the EU. In a series of cases, the Court of Justice declared that if a citizen goes to another EU country in order to receive medical treatment, they should be reimbursed by their national health insurance scheme under the same conditions as at home. If this treatment requires a stay in hospital, the home country can insist that they give prior authorization before treatment takes place. But the court has ruled that this can't be refused for standard procedures, unless the same or equivalent treatment can be provided at home within a reasonable time. This principle is rooted in the freedom to provide services, which is enshrined in the EU Treaty. One of the many treaty articles agreed upon for the protection of EU citizens and safeguarded by the Court of Justice of the European Union.